Today, should we send more weapons to Ukraine? Is the north of England getting its fair share of money? And can a deal with the EU bring back power sharing in Northern Ireland? This is Politics Live. Joining me today, Conservative MP Anthony Brown, Liberal Democrat MP Sarah Olney, Guardian columnist Jonathan Freedland and former Northern Ireland First Minister Arlene Foster. On the programme.
Putin expected Europe and the United States to weaken our resolve. He expected our support for Ukraine to crumble with time. He was wrong. He was wrong.
The West agrees to send dozens of tanks to Ukraine, but President Zelensky wants more.
The key now is speed and volume. We have to form a fist of tanks, a fist of freedom, which will not allow tyranny to rise again.
There is a vision for the future of this country in which we unite our amazing country and level up across the country.
That was 3 years ago. Are the Tories delivering for the North? We'll ask the North of Tyne Mayor Jamie Driscoll. And should this convicted rapist go to a women's jail? Let's start with the story of tanks, Leopard 2 tanks, following Germany's decision to give it the green light going to Ukraine. Let's look at a couple of the front pages. The Daily Mail, finally, it says, the West unites to defend freedom. And then if we roll on to the Mirror, very similar headline, World United Against Evil. You heard President Biden there in the headlines. My opening question to the panel, starting with you, Anthony, is there any limit to the support, military support, we should give Ukraine?
We absolutely need to give the Ukraine the full support it needs to make sure that it wins and regains its territory. The UK was the first to give NATO standard tanks. With the Western alliance has been held together. That's really, really important, the point that Joe Biden was just making. And we need to make sure that, see how those tanks go. They've got a lot of tanks they've got to absorb now.
But in your mind, there's no limit. There's no limit to the help that we could give Ukraine. It could go beyond tanks.
We've got to, first of all, see how far we get with the tanks and whether that is enough. These are NATO standard tanks, very, very powerful, far more powerful than Russian tanks. The question that's been raised is about fighter jets. That's really a decision for another day. That is far more complicated than tanks. You've got to train the people to fly the jets, train them to maintain them. You need to keep the Western alliance together as well. So I would say, first step, tanks, get them operated and then see how that goes.
Is there any limit in your mind to the level of support, military or otherwise, we could give to Ukraine?
Well, we're Liberal Democrats very pleased to see that the tanks are going to Ukraine. It's something we've been calling for a long time. We want to see as much support as we can possibly give Ukraine, whether that's military or, in any other way, humanitarian aid. I think it's really important we see what happens next. I think everything is very uncertain. We want to see how events unfold. We want to work with international partners, and we'll see what happens next.
I mean, it says, reportedly, that it'll be transformational. Because Germany has made this quite big decision for a country that has resisted historically post the war, Jonathan, to get involved in any way in any conflicts. Now it is, and it's the green light to other countries that have these Leopard 2 tanks to do the same. Does that also mean that for everyone else there is no limit to what we'll do?
I think even if there is a limit, nobody is ever going to say so, because it's partly about signalling to Vladimir Putin, and you heard that in the comments of Joe Biden, that was one of the reasons why in the end Germany had to act and why the rest of the alliance had to act, simply because Putin was gambling on Europe not being united, the West not being united. And for that argument alone, I think the pressure became impossible on Germany to do anything but to send them. I think Anthony's right, the next stage is going to be a discussion about jets. This is going to keep on going as long as it's not over. But the support, I think, is still there. And if anything, it keeps it's uniting and solidifying.
I mean, there are fears of escalation in general. I mean, it is this balance between the two, isn't it? And certainly the Russians are saying that this escalates things. That's no surprise whatsoever. So do you think there's any limit?
Well, I think what we need to do is work with the Ukrainians. Very interesting to hear the President say that we need more. And of course he would say that
he wants
because
hundreds.
he's wanting to end this war. And we shouldn't forget that this war's been going on for a year now, nearly. And the people of Ukraine are suffering greatly. And it is actually a humanitarian crisis in terms of the citizens that live in Ukraine. So are we going to stand by, as Boris Johnson said this week, or are we actually going to help? I think this government and indeed this country should be proud of its record on Ukraine. But we, of course, have to keep watching to see if there's more we can do to help.
All right, let's talk about the Tory party chairman, Nadeem Zahawi, because the head of HM Revenue and Customs, HMRC, has been questioned by MPs, including by you, I think, Sarah, on that committee, in the Commons Public Accounts Committee. Let's have a listen to what Jim Harris said about the penalty that has been paid. He wasn't talking about this case directly, but why penalties are actually given to people over their tax affairs.
There are no penalties for innocent errors in your tax affairs. So if you take reasonable care but nevertheless make a mistake, whilst you will be liable for the tax and for interest if it's paid late, you would not be liable for a penalty. But if your error was as a result of carelessness, then legislation says that a penalty could apply in those circumstances.
Anthony Brown, what do you say to that? He said there are no penalties for making innocent errors in your tax affairs. Well, we know that Nadeem Zahawi has paid a penalty in his settlement with HMRC.
Well, this is about carelessness. I mean, I think my position hasn't really changed from yesterday, actually, which is that we need to know the facts. I did a discussion programme with Labour and Lib Dems on it yesterday. They're asking lots of questions, and actually there clearly are questions to answer. And I think it's right that the Prime Minister is going through due process. He appointed this ethics advisor, Sir Laurie Magnus. Sir Laurie is looking at it. We need to know all the detail about what's happened. This inquiry needs to be very, very quick, clearly from a public confidence point of view.
And a political point of view, no doubt.
And a political point of view, but it's quite difficult to have discussions about this without actually knowing the full facts.
Well, we do know some of the facts, don't we? We know that he paid a penalty, and we now know from Jim Harris, the chief executive of HMRC, that a penalty would only arise where it was considered someone had failed to take reasonable care of their tax matters. Is it right that someone holds high office, particularly the office of Chancellor, but in this particular case, Tory party chairman under Rishi Sunak, if they haven't taken reasonable care of their tax matters?
There's more to the story just than about the HMRC. It's also about what was disclosed when. You know, what was said when he was appointed Chancellor. What was said to the current Prime Minister Rishi Sunak when he appointed him chairman. And so that there's a question mark here about whether the ministerial code was followed. And Sir Laurie Magnus.
Just to point out, though, Anthony, actually, we also know there's a discrepancy in that from yesterday's Prime Minister's questions, because the week before Rishi Sunak stood up in the House of Commons and he said that Nadeem Zahawi had addressed these matters in full, or the tax matters had been addressed in full, and then new information came to light. So Nadeem Zahawi didn't give a full account of his tax affairs.
New information came out to Number 10, as I understand it.
So he didn't give a full account.
Over the weekend. Well, this is the whole point of what the independent ethics advisor will be looking at, is about whether the ministerial code was broken or not in terms of disclosures, and that's what the decision will be made on.
Do you think he can survive this, Nadeem Zahawi?
Well, it is death by 1,000 cuts, isn't it? Because more and more things will come out. And as Anthony says, until you get the full picture, the full facts, then it becomes a real problem. It is quite interesting the way we are now looking very much at the words that are used, and then we're asking questions about the words that are used. So innocent becomes very much an important word. You've seen the way Jim Harris has responded to that. He said if it was innocent, there wouldn't be a penalty. So then you go into, well, it was innocent carelessness. Well, is there such a thing as carelessness being innocent? You know, and then you get into all of this terminology. I think the real problem for the Tory party now is that this is damaging, because it's continually being on the front pages, and then they're not talking about the things that they want to get talking about, and we all know what the problem is.
I mean, you're agreeing with that, Jonathan. Can he survive?
I don't think so. I think it's striking that Arlene Foster said, you know, death by 1,000 cuts, because that ends in death, political death, and it's just.
Well, thanks for making that clear, Jonathan.
So that's where it's going. I mean, just on the point about the wording, you know, careless and the definition you read out
can mean negligent.
negligent. innocence, is what it sounds like. And certainly if you're saying that if it was innocent, there'd be no penalty. My understanding as well is if the penalty is at 30%, which some of the reporting has suggested it will be, that is really at the upper end where negligence crosses over into something even more serious. That's right at the top end of the negligence spectrum. So I don't think any of this is sustainable for him. And I think all those questions about when exactly it was disclosed are another world of pain for him. So this only ends in one way, I think.
All right, and as you've said, Anthony, this inquiry is going on by Sir Laurie Magnus and will report relatively quickly. Let's have a look at this tweet from the left-leaning think tank, the IPPR, the Institute for Public Policy Research. It says if the north of England were a country, it would be second only to Greece for the lowest levels of investment in the OECD, red exclamation mark. Then, according to their report, the north of England receives one of the lowest levels of investment among advanced economies. Joining us from Newcastle is the Labour Mayor of the North of Tyne, Jamie Driscoll. Does this report surprise you, Jamie?
It doesn't, I'm afraid, Joe. It is that report covers both private sector and public sector investment, and the two are intimately linked. So the combined authority I've been running for the past 3.5 years, every pound we invest, we lever in huge multipliers in terms of private investment, and every pound we invest returns more than £3 per Treasury in payroll taxes alone. But the issue is, it's just not enough. I have a core budget of £20 million a year, which is a drop in the ocean. So, yes, we know how to do this as regional mayors. We're very good at it, cross-party. But it's the scale of it. So the idea that we have levelled up, well, you know, the Levelling Up Fund was £32 per person in the north. Council cuts have been £413 per person. This is not about a Northern Winchfest or anything like that. It is the case. It's economic common sense.
OK.
All of the country generating wealth and not just channeling everything, because the Green Book values show that it's higher land values. And closing a lot of these long-term inequalities in terms of health, in terms of educational attainment, and particularly transport infrastructure in the northeast.
All right, Anthony.
It's in Russia. Sorry, in London.
Well, I mean, the IPPR is a left-leaning think tank. It's unlikely to say
You've just
something.
heard Jamie. But you've just heard what Jamie said about the economic reality.
The government's absolutely committed to levelling up. It's announced various funds. I mean, there was a £4 billion total levelling up fund, which did go per capita far more in the north than the south. There's big projects like the Eden project of the north that's opening up in Morecambe. I think it is £50 million there. HS2 still absolutely committed to that. It's interesting, the data, I didn't realise it from the headline, is both private sector investment and public sector investment, because one of the keys here will be clearly driving up private sector investments and making it more attractive. And you look at things like the free ports, for example, and there's a lot of big economic zones in like Teesside and so on that actually will help, or it's designed to help inward investment from the private sector.
Jamie?
Yeah, but HS2 isn't coming to the north, and it was never coming to Newcastle. The Northern Powerhouse Rail, which was in the Conservative manifesto in 2019, has been ditched. We're very good. I'm working with pension companies to lever in investment. We work with our small businesses. We were the #1 region for inward investment last year in England. We are very good at it, but we don't have the financial firepower. And at the current rate, these little scattergun projects of the Eden project here, opening a leisure centre there, that is so stop-start that it doesn't work. Because when I'm talking to private sector investors wanting to bring in large amounts of money, what they need is certainty. Otherwise, you won't get the private sector to invest. And when you're throwing in a beauty pageant kind of bid, and then it comes down to random allocations, in effect, you cannot plan strategically. So it's good that there's investment in R&D goes into Cambridge and the Golden Triangle. It should also.
It's funny. Well, it's funny you mentioned Cambridge. I mean, first of all, just broadly, it just doesn't live up to the scale of perhaps the ambition that was imagined by people like Jamie. Would you agree with that? That this begging bowl, as I think the West Midlands Conservative Mayor Andy Street has said, there should be an end to this begging bowl culture for money.
Well, it's grants. I mean, always places apply for grants, and I mean, I agree with you that we clearly need to do more. I mean, levelling up is a big generational project. I mean, it was never going to happen overnight, and in fact, indeed, if you go back to the last Labour government, they were very keen on didn't use the term levelling up, but it was the same sort of concept of trying to help the north. And you know, it is a long-term project. The most important thing is the government remains committed to it, and you know, I'm sure you'll get a lot of other projects coming forwards, other schemes, ideas and policies coming forward to make sure we do level up as a country.
But Jamie mentioned Cambridge. Cambridge. Your constituency is in Cambridgeshire. I mean, this isn't left-leaning think tank IPPR. This is the Spectator saying the Oxford-Cambridge arc, which is up for extra investment from the government, shows why the Tories don't get it. You don't get it, according to the Spectator.
Well, I mean, I did read that article. It's by a young guy who's frustrated about being excluded from the housing market, and I totally get that. You know, home ownership rates do need to go up. I think they were arguing in that article that actually they should invest far more in the Oxcam arc, but it's difficult to reconcile that with the levelling up, because obviously one of the concerns is that you invest more in the southeast, the Golden Triangle of London, Cambridge, and Oxford, and Cambridge is boomtown. I mean, it's got so much investment, doesn't know what to do with it, and actually, so, you know, the government and what Michael Gove has been trying to do as the Levelling Up Secretary is balance out that sort of growth in the south with growth in the north.
Well, I'm going to come to the rest of you, I promise a minute. But, Jamie, you wanted to say something in response.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. We're talking about the think tanks there. So the policy exchange, I think Anthony was involved in. Onward, again, these are Tory think tanks. They all agree, I work with them, that we need fiscal devolution in this country if we're ever going to unleash the North. Because when decision-making occurs in London, in Whitehall, in South West 1, we are always forgotten about. And we've shown it. The track record is there. The evidence is there of what we've achieved in the last few years when we get the budgets. 50% increase in value for money in skills training once that budget was devolved to us. So that's what we really need. It's the quantum of money, but crucially, it's the ability to tie it together, because no one in Whitehall knows the Chamber of Commerce chair, the local enterprise partnership there, all the university heads, the local businesses, the charity sector in our region, but I do. So we're able to operate on a strategic, systemic basis rather than ad hoc, short-term funding arrangements.
Sarah?
Well, hard to disagree with everything that Jamie said there. I think there's no doubt that with the Levelling Up funding awards that we saw last week, it is, and again, as Andy Streeter said, the begging bowl culture. What we really need is some joined up strategic thinking about what it's going to take to boost investment, private sector investment, public sector investment in those parts of the country where there are, you know, there's opportunities for growth. So let's look at it that way. And I think it is really important that we're looking at, you know, what is it? Is it transport infrastructure? Is it investment in research and development? But until the government's actually got a real proper strategic plan, as opposed to just these little tiny parcels of money here and there to the lucky, you know, the lucky towns and cities. And I mean, I think it's been a bit of a waste of time.
Oh, you think it's been a total waste of time?
A bit of a waste of time.
Sorry.
What I mean is, you've had all of these local authorities. They've been working on their bids, and it's been taking them away from other work they could have been doing. But again, just to emphasise what Jamie was saying there, we've seen local authorities all across the country have had their budgets slashed, and now a few of them are getting tiny bits and pieces back. It's no way to have a proper strategic approach to improving growth and productivity.
Fiscal devolution, Arlene?
Well, I see a different way of doing it, actually, and it's taking Jamie's point about local communities knowing on the ground what's important for them and what needs to be done. So you have, as we did in Belfast, and indeed up in the northwest as well, have where they had city deals, and they worked with Westminster, they worked with Stormont, and they were able to get a pot of money which they could then deliver on the ground. I see that should be the way for this to happen as well. So we have plans for the southwest of Northern Ireland, for example, and then that is the plan that government should then fund. So you're working together between local government, between the devolved administrations and Westminster. You're having that togetherness, as it were, rather than Westminster decide, no, I like the look of that, I'll give some money to that, which doesn't really work.
What does it really mean, fiscal devolution, Jonathan, in real terms?
Well, I mean, first of all, you can't get away from the context here, which is there's been a decade of starving many of these local and regional authorities of funds from austerity at the beginning and huge budget cuts since. So Jamie Driscoll and people like him have been dealing with shrinking budgets for over a decade. But beyond that, yeah, I think giving the levers of decision-making to the people on the ground. Our model in this country is broken. It's far too centralised, in which Westminster dispenses largesse to the lucky few, as we've been hearing. Instead, the decision-making, actually, I would have local and regional authorities have the ability to raise funds for themselves as well as to spend it, to borrow, to invest, to have the kind of financial muscle that can enable them not to enter essentially a lottery or a beauty pageant and hope that they get lucky. Morecambe have got lucky with the Eden Project. On another day, you lose out. Instead, they should should be in charge of their own fiscal affairs.
That's never popular with local politicians,
No.
but they then have to take the decision to ask their ratepayers for more money, and that never goes down well.
But that's what I mean about whether you'd be in favour of it, because yes, it's ideal in theory, but no one wants that.
We do have one of the most centralised taxes.
I think Jamie wants that power.
Any advanced country in the world, and I used to work for the former mayor of London, and I kept arguing for more devolution. Even in a big metropolis like London, the mayor has virtually no control over taxation.
Whatever happened to
precept on council tax.
We'll let that hang in the air. Jamie, you wanted to come in on that. And also, just as you're talking, Jamie, I know you can't see it, but I'm going to read you this headline. BBC News: spirit of Thatcherism will help north of England, says Gove, Michael Gove, the Levelling Up Secretary. Will that help?
Well, I heard Michael say that yesterday at the Convention of the North. It didn't go down well in the North. Let's park that one, shall we?
All right.
So fiscal devolution is not about raising more taxes from the people in the North. Our business rates, for example, based in the North East is £300 per capita. In London, it's £940 per capita. So I'd have to raise taxes 3 times higher. What I want is powers like land value capture, or I've created 14 years worth of jobs, according to the target government gave me in 3 years. So can I have the payroll taxes that we created from that back? Can we have a regional wealth fund? That is, in fact, written into our new devolution deal. So one of the things we're already doing is we've created an investment fund vehicle. We're levering in money from pension funds. There's £3.4 trillion in pension funds looking to invest somewhere, all not making enough money from government bonds at the moment. And what we want is the support from government to be able to lever that huge amount of money in, which is our pensions. We want it to grow. So that's, I think, where innovation needs to come.
All right.
And that will only happen by talking to local leaders, I think.
Jamie Driscoll, thank you very much. I'm sure you're making all these presentations to government ministers. Thank you for joining us today. Just before we move on, very briefly, Anthony, this headline in the Financial Times: Liz Truss, former Prime Minister, to join Tory right-wing clamour for immediate tax cuts. She still believes in those, and she'd like them to come quickly. Would you like to see tax cuts in the budget?
You can only do tax cuts in a way that is fiscally responsible, that doesn't spook the markets. We tried that; it didn't work. You've got to tackle inflation first. That's the big evil. I mean, I think like all Conservatives, and I believe like the Labour Party, we want to see tax cuts overall, taxes at the highest rate.
Sure, that's understood, but not in this budget.
In a measured, sustainable way.
Let me show you this headline on a different subject in the Daily Telegraph. Baffling Brexit plan will wreck trade, according to the head of Marks and Spencer's. To get someone to explain that to us, it was a story actually broken by our Northern Ireland economics and business editor, John Campbell. He's in Belfast. Tell us about the story.
Well, this is mostly about Marks and Spencer's business, not in Northern Ireland, but in the Republic of Ireland. Because if we think about what this is really about, it's around the Northern Ireland Protocol. And that's the post-Brexit deal, which means that goods coming from England, Scotland and Wales into Northern Ireland are subject to checks and controls. The UK and the EU want to reduce those checks and controls. One way they're thinking of doing this is by labelling food products for UK sale only. So those products coming in to Northern Ireland then would be unlikely to leak into the EU's single market. Now, the reason that's an issue for Marks and Spencer's is because they have quite a big business in the Republic of Ireland, and they are saying what it would mean for them is they would have to produce 2 separate sets of packaging, one for the whole of the UK and then a separate set for the Republic of Ireland, whereas at the moment they basically treat the island of Ireland as one unit. So they say that would add cost and complexity to their business. And in some ways, this is quite a narrow problem. It's really a problem for UK food retailers who also happen to have a business in the Republic of Ireland and what it would mean for them in terms of extra cost.
John Campbell, stay with us just a moment. Arlene, what's your response to the story, even if it is relatively narrow in that sense, but in terms of solving what's seen as the problems of the practicalities of the Northern Ireland Protocol?
Well, it won't solve it. I think that's very clear. And it would increase cost. It would actually put a lot of pressure on primary producers, our farmers as well, from the big retailers. The way in which this should have been dealt with right at the very start, of course, was trusted traders, big operators like Marks and Spencer's, like Tesco, like Asda, who go into Northern Ireland, but who also go into the Republic of Ireland, and they could have dealt with it through that mechanism. There was small businesses exemptions that could have been used as well. There was technical proposals put forward, but were rejected because they were quote-unquote unicorn ideas. All of a sudden, they're back on the table again. this didn't need to be where we are now, and we could have dealt with this if there had been the political will, but of course there wasn't the political will, and that was the problem.
I mean, what's the chance of your colleagues, your former colleagues in the DUP, going back into power sharing, which of course is the political consequence of this?
Well, they've set down 7 tests, which I think are well known to everyone, and they will judge whatever comes forward on those 7 tests. But I don't see any real urgency to deal with this matter, despite the fact that Northern Ireland is being treated differently from the rest of the United Kingdom, and it's been going on nearly now for 2 years.
Jonathan?
Well, first of all, we should remember that the Brexiters said one of the reasons for Brexit was to cut down on red tape. And what do we see? It's adding much more red tape. Yeah. But besides the point about the detail of this, the big fundamental point is always still the same, which is you could not leave, Britain, the UK could not leave the European Union, Customs Union, single market without there being some frontier, boundary between the UK and
which could have been digitally handled.
And the European Union. And that border was either going to be on the island of Ireland, no, that was impossible because that would undo the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, or it was going to be down the Irish Sea. Both of those should have been unpalatable, and therefore the last thing the UK should have done is to leave, especially for Northern Ireland, which is why I think the people of Northern Ireland voted against Brexit. They got this, they understood it, and why I find it amazing that the Unionist Party, Democratic Unionist Party, ever supported Brexit in the first place, because clearly this headache was going to come.
Because we wanted to make our own decisions, and it was a sovereignty issue. As Economy Minister for Northern Ireland, I could see the regulation that was coming from Europe, and it was damping down entrepreneurial.
So much
yes,
more
because of the protocol. Because of the protocol, and of course it should have been dealt with in a better way. And this red herring of a hard border, which was used very effectively, I have to say, by the Irish government, it was never going to happen. Who was going to put the hard border in place? It could have been dealt with in a very effective way, using technology, using trusted traders, using business exemption, but it wasn't, Joe, because of the political situation where the Irish government wanted to keep us in the single market for very political reasons.
Jonathan?
Well, I think the technology thing was one of these mythic sort of, that was a unicorn idea if ever there was when people talked about it, but nobody could ever make it tangible. I think this reason is, or rather this problem was the reason why of the 28 member states in the European Union, the UK actually should have been the last to even entertain leaving, because uniquely in the whole of those 28 countries, we had this border within the country itself, within the UK. And therefore, the whole idea was, and people warned of it at the time, John Major, Tony Blair, others said, you cannot mess with this very delicate set of arrangements since the Good Friday Belfast Agreement, and you will wreck it and cause havoc if you leave. And yet, to me, on my mind, still incredibly, the Democratic Unionists and other unionists sided with a project that was bound to cause harm, particularly to Northern Ireland.
Are we saying there are no borders in the European Union, in the European continent?
Well, within the
yes, there are. Of course there are borders, and they are dealt with in a...
But not a border between the EU and the non-EU within a single country.
But if a country decided to leave, you're saying we should have been the last to leave. If another country left, there would have been that border, and it would have been dealt with in a practical way. But because of the politics between the Irish government and the European Union, we were presented with the Northern Ireland Protocol, which has caused real damage to British citizens like myself in Northern Ireland.
What do you say to the government?
I said to the government, get on with dealing with the protocol. We were talking about manufacturing in the UK in the House of Lords before I came over here, and I felt like saying, well, the manufacturers in Northern Ireland are actually being prevented from getting into their own single market, never mind the European single market, because of this Northern Ireland Protocol. Anthony?
Well, I mean, it's simply obvious that actually the negotiations are currently ongoing, and actually the mood music from both sides recently has been more positive. And my
why is that? Do you know why that is?
My general view of this is actually, although there are difficulties with the border, as Jonathan pointed out, that actually it's totally solvable if there's good political will on both sides, and that has been lacking. I think it's more there now. I think if both sides want to reach an agreement that is practical, I think that is totally possible. Yeah, but I hope that is what is happening.
Well, that's between the EU. The reason I asked the question because that's between the EU and the UK. It doesn't sound like Arlene and perhaps those colleagues from the DUP are positive.
I totally understand the frustration of the DUP that there's been this border down the Irish Sea, which has been caused all sorts of problems for exporters within the UK, or from one part of the UK to the other part of the UK.
Should that have been foreseen?
But
It was
It
foreseen.
was foreseen.
It was foreseen, and that's why I think the politicians warned against it, and the people of Northern Ireland voted against it.
The thing about borders is they can be perfect in theory or perfect in practice. And actually, the trouble with the Northern Ireland border is they've tried to design one that was perfect in theory, but actually really quite difficult in practice. What matters with borders, all borders are permeable to some extent. People and goods cross borders that shouldn't do. What matters is whether it causes any damage. And so, if you have schemes like the digital thing, may not be 100% perfect, but could be good. Trusted trader schemes, etc. If both sides, so you look at the leakage of tobacco across the tax-free tobacco across the English Channel. If people just have personal use, didn't really matter. So soon it becomes industrial scale and starts undermining tax receipts in the UK. You have a specific thing that clamps down on that and says that is illegal imports that are causing a problem, and you focus on that. If there's goodwill on both sides, you'll get a border that works without damaging either side. If there's not goodwill on both sides and they both aim for some theoretically perfect border, it won't happen.
Sarah, Lib Dem policy is for the whole of the UK to be part of the single market at some point. That would solve it.
Well, I mean, there's absolutely no doubt we didn't want to leave the European Union
That's
in the first
clear.
place, and that is something that we campaign very hard. I massively regret that we're in the situation that we're in, and you can see the impact. I mean, our trade volumes have declined precipitously. You know, small businesses are finding it harder and harder to export. The prospects and our economic growth is enormously harmed as a result. What we're saying is that we need to start from where we are and we need to move forward. What we want to see in the immediate term is better relationships with the EU. We want to resolve these issues. We would like to see a veterinary agreement and recognition of professional qualifications.
And that is aligning of standards, just so people understand.
Aligning of standards, exactly. We'd like to look at rejoining the customs union in due course, and then one day rejoin the single market. We think that would be in the UK's best interests.
Well, the rejoining the single market means we'd lose all controls over a lot of our regulation of our most important industries, like financial services. And this is why the governor of the Bank of England was early in the stage warned against it, that as a global financial centre, it would be really dangerous not to have any control over financial services regulation, which is what would happen if we joined the single market without being in the EU.
As the Lib Dems Business and Treasury spokesperson, I spend a lot of time talking to business groups and the city, and they're really clear the regulation they want to see high standards of regulation, because that creates a level playing field, it gives consumers confidence, but more than anything else, they want to see certainty, and the idea that we're going to be constantly chopping and changing.
We want high global standards, but I don't think any of them want to be in the single market. The international
London was doing much better as a financial centre when we were in the European Union single market than it is outside it. The idea that Frankfurt or London haven't been successful financial centres inside the EU is mythic.
I'm just going to have a final word from John Campbell, because he's been listening very carefully. I don't know what you make of the discussion that you've heard, John, or about the sort of level of support for the protocol, the trading arrangements post-Brexit in Northern Ireland.
Well, the majority of MLAs or Assembly members who are returned to the Assembly in Northern Ireland in the last election are at least tolerant of the protocol. So we should just be clear about that, whereas Unionist members oppose it. I suppose in terms of, is there a deal which will get the DUP back in? It's, potentially you could fudge some of those 7 tests, but I just think you need to look at the kind of the wider context here, where the DUP's unionist rivals are pretty clear they will attack the party if they settle for anything less than the total removal of the protocol. The DUP would be going back into Stormont with a very difficult budget and with a Sinn Féin First Minister. So would they really want to do that at a time when they are facing into local elections in just a few months? I think you'd have to be quite optimistic that there is a deal which can be landed, which is going to satisfy the DUP in the short term at least.
John Campbell, thank you very much for joining us from Belfast. Let me show everybody this headline in The Guardian. Trans woman guilty of raping 2 women remanded in female prison in Scotland. This is the story about Isla Bryson, a transgender woman who has been convicted of raping 2 women in attacks carried out before she changed gender. She is now in custody and is waiting sentencing, but where she should serve that sentence will be the subject of heated debate. Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister of Scotland, has been asked about this. Let's have a listen.
It would not be appropriate for me, in respect of any prisoner, to give details of where they are being incarcerated. But given the understandable public and parliamentary concern in this case, I can confirm to Parliament that this prisoner will not be incarcerated at Cornton Vale Women's Prison. And I hope that provides assurance to the public, Presiding Officer, not least to the victims in this particular case.
That was Nicola Sturgeon. We're joined now by SNP MSP Audrey Nicholl, joining us from Edinburgh. Hello to you. Audrey, can you just clear up for us, is Isla Bryson at the moment on remand in a woman's prison in Scotland and will stay there until sentencing?
Well, I'm like you. I've just listened to the First Minister's update, First Minister's questions, and as it stands at the moment, I'm not party to any information on where this trans woman is at the moment. But as you heard from the statement that the First Minister gave, it is not the plan that she is incarcerated in a women's prison going forward. So I'm afraid I can't really answer your question.
Right. So she won't go or won't stay in the prison that she's in at the moment. But does that mean she's not going to go to any other women's prison?
Well, again, that's not for me to decide, and we've not been made party to that information.
Right. So you're having no say and no role in this whatsoever, because obviously this is a high-profile case and it's being watched very carefully in light of the Scottish Parliament having passed a bill, the Gender Recognition Reform Bill, to make it easier for people to legally change their gender. It is being blocked currently by the UK government on the basis they say that it undermines UK-wide equalities laws and perhaps threatens women-only spaces. Can you see why there are concerns about that?
I absolutely do, and you know, I've spent my working life in policing before coming into the Scottish Parliament, working to protect the rights of women and girls. So I absolutely understand the public interest and some of the public discourse on this issue. I would, however, say that it's not helpful to conflate the work that's been done in the Scottish Parliament around the Gender Recognition Reform Bill with an operational decision that is being made around the custodial arrangements for a trans woman in a prison in Scotland. The bill does not give trans women any further rights in the context of where they are accommodated if they are a convicted person in a prison. Wow. And I think it's unhelpful for us to maybe sort of conflate the two at this point in time.
Well, I'm not sure about the conflation. We'll discuss that here in the studio. You've made clear you don't know whether or not Isla Bryson will go to a different women's prison to serve out her sentence. Would you be happy for that to happen, personally? Would you be relaxed about that?
Well, I think the fact is she is she's waiting sentencing, so she is a convicted person. As such, she will require to be accommodated in a prison. Now, where that is and whether it's a women's prison or
but I'm asking you
prison,
if you would be happy, because Isla Bryson has transitioned. She is a transgender woman, but the rapes were committed before she changed gender to become a woman. Would you be happy for her to stay in a different women's prison?
Well, I think the question here is more about...
No, the question... No, but I'm asking you this question just because I think our viewers would be interested to know, as a member of Holyrood, an SNP member of Holyrood, what is your view? What's your opinion on that? What would your constituents think?
Well, my view is that in terms of the Scottish Prison Service and their ability and the role that they play in accommodating trans women, then I'm absolutely confident that they have the right controls, balances and checks and risk assessment arrangements in place. They risk assess men and women every day in terms of risk and vulnerability. in terms of the safety of
So
the
you're
person.
happy, right? So you're happy for that to happen. But I have to say, there is some, we call it copy, some news from my colleague David Cowan, the Home Affairs correspondent at BBC Scotland, who says exactly what you said. They'll assess the risk, but they may decide that Isla Bryson be held in solitary confinement or in some sort of segregated cell. But that can't go on forever, can it?
Well, again, I don't work within the prison service, and if that is a judgment that they make, that's absolutely an operational decision for them to take, and that will be based on a range of different criteria that informs their risk assessment and their risk planning approaches.
All right, Audrey, just perhaps you'd stay with us. Anthony, what's your response?
I think the women prisoners have a right to feel safe where they are, and this is a male-bodied person completely who's a convicted rapist, who's got a history of lifelong violence against women, who's completely physically attacked, capable of committing rape again. History shows that sex offenders doesn't change because you identify as a different gender. His wife, her wife, has said today in the papers that she's absolutely convinced it's a former wife, that it's a ruse just so he can go into a woman's prison. Well, women prisoners have a right to feel safe in their prison, and I think this would seriously contravene it. So I think this trans woman needs to go into either a trans unit or he might decide to, he might change his mind and go into men's prison. I
mean, this case could end up being quite instructive in terms of legislation. Audrey making clear in her mind that they're not the same thing. We shouldn't conflate the idea of making it easier under the bill that's been passed to change your gender legally in Scotland and this particular case of where transgender women should be held if they've committed crimes against women, whether they should be held in women's prisons.
Yeah, I don't think you have to even get that far. This is one of those rare cases actually, where the problem seems very complicated, but the solution might be quite simple. And in my mind, the solution is anyone who has committed rape should be nowhere near women prisoners. And this person's a convicted rapist and shouldn't be anywhere near women prisoners.
Arlene?
Yeah, I entirely agree with that. But I mean, we were told during the debate around the Gender Recognition Reform Act that any suggestion that people would use this as a way to evade justice or to go into a women's prison was all a lot of nonsense. And we were just, scaremongering and all the rest of it. This is hugely concerning. And in terms of, I used to work with the Girl Guides. There's a real concern in women's organisations, whether for young people or indeed for those who are vulnerable, that this will become something that will have to be dealt with. And, this could have been foreseen. I mean, when was he found guilty? And from that to the point where he's going into, or when did he commit the crime? From the point that he's found guilty, he's been able to transition into a woman. So this, to me, is completely wrong. And there should have been a wider conversation about it. There was an opportunity in the Scottish Parliament to deal with these sorts of cases, and it was rejected by the Scottish Government, and they didn't accept the amendment that was put forward, I think, by Conservative members in the Scottish Parliament.
I'll get Audrey to comment in a moment. But your party in Scotland, MSP, supported it too, didn't they?
Well, I think MSPs from all parties, including the Conservatives, supported the gender recognition reform. So, but I mean, as Audrey said, obviously that hasn't come into force yet because the UK government have issued their Section 10.
But what do you say in response to Arlene saying that it was nonsense to say that these sorts of cases wouldn't come up and would have to be dealt with?
Well, I think there's no doubt that in this particular case, this person should not be in a woman's prison. I mean, I don't think there's any doubt about that, given their past history of violence against women. It's just unthinkable that they should be in a woman's prison. But I mean, the current approach, the Ministry of Justice at the moment say all of these things should be done under a risk assessment. I find it incredible that the risk assessment in this case did not come up with no way should this person be in a women's prison. But that doesn't mean to say that the risk assessment, taking each case on its merits, isn't the right way forward.
Audrey, we haven't got long, but I just want you to respond to what you've heard, particularly to Arlene's points that she raised.
Well, I think in terms of kind of, if I can just sort of come back to the...
It's going to be so brief.
bill.
I'm so sorry, Audrey. I should have come back to you sooner. I'm not sure we have got time. I will make sure that you come back on again to discuss this further. But from all of us here, thank you very much.